Okay. Oh, here we go. Hi, everybody. Welcome, welcome. So sorry for that 2-minute delay here. Your classic PowerPoint user error. When sometimes it just simply doesn't agree with you and you don't know what to do, but delay the session for 2 minutes or so. So thanks for joining, everybody. We're going to be talking today about 4 non-IT third-party risks that can derail even in the most secure companies. And we're very excited to have Bryan Littlefair join us once more. Hi, Bryan. How are you?
Great. Good to be here.
Great. Always a pleasure to have you. And we have our very own Scott Lang here. And we're always happy to have him join. He'll be bringing us home towards the end of the session. So look forward to that. And I'm Amanda. I'm your host here at mostly all the webinars. We also have Melissa that does this as well. So a couple of housekeepings. I'm sure you guys have been here before, especially all the fans of Bryan. I tend to see the similar names pop up. But just as a refresher, we're all muted. But please utilize the Q&A, like specifically the Q&A question little box, because then your questions get lost in the chat. So use those. We're going to do the questions towards the end of the session, how we typically do. We'll leave time for that. You'll get the recording as early as tomorrow, if not sooner, but we do really love when you guys ask great questions and we utilize, Scott and Bryan's brain as much as you possibly can during this hour. So that's about it from me. I will leave you all to it. Bryan, I'm going to let you take it away.
Great.
Oh my God, hold on. So sorry. I forgot about the poll question. See, this is what happens when you wait 2 minutes. Okay, keep talking, but everyone else, hey, answer this while you're multitasking. While you're eating your lunch while you're watching this. Oh my God, I hope everyone woke up now. I just screamed. All right, continue.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. And yeah, the PowerPoint error was on my side, so Scott's going to be driving my slides for me. So thanks for that, Scott. So those of you that don't know me, I run a company called Cambridge Cyber Advisors here in the UK. I've been a security professional pretty much all my working career, and I've ran security for lots of big multinationals, but equally smaller organizations as well. And I do work with, the UK government and governments around the world. And this is a really interesting topic that we're going to be discussing today. Mainly talk about cyber and information security, but obviously being a CISO, your remit is wider than that. So it's great to give this topic some airtime. So Scott, next slide. So a little bit of scene setting from me, just in terms of what we're going to be talking about. So if you think about third-party risk management, certainly in the organizations that I typically consult with, it normally sits in the security function. And then obviously, rightly so, being security professionals that sit within that function, our focus is quite often on the cyber risk or the information security risk or the physical security risk that are presented from a supplier to our parent organization. But if we think about the term, it's third-party risk management. It doesn't really mention cyber or information security in there. So we need to be looking holistically. We need to be making sure that we're looking at the full risk position that any partner, supplier, broker, third party, fourth party, nth party can present to our organization. So it's really good to, as I say, give this some airtime and start to look at what are some of those non-IT security risks that we need to be looking at. And I think, one of the things that's only going to continue, and we have to kind of embrace it, is that regulation is going to continue to drive this space forward. And obviously more and more industries and sectors are becoming regulated. And when they do, regulators obviously start to dictate how things happen because they want to standardize that approach. They want to make sure that things are happening in an appropriate manner. And, certainly those entities and organizations that are regulated at the moment, certainly financial services, telecommunications, utilities around the world, one of the biggest risks, if not the biggest risk, is from the distributed supply chain. So quite naturally, regulators are saying, you need to get a grip on this. You need to be running an effective and efficient process. And obviously an effective and efficient process doesn't use Microsoft Excel. It uses obviously some of the tools and technologies like Prevalent that have been built in this, in this space in mind, purposely developed to be able to capture and present a clear risk position to you, the user. And, it's really interesting, I'm a big reader of the Verizon Threat Report and others that are published around the world, but, we are starting to see the reason why the regulators are focusing on this area, There 62% of system compromises came via the partner channel. And obviously, you know, I'm not at Blackout this year, but I do go normally to Vegas and partake in that conference. And, you know, some of the conversations that are happening around there from people that are very well connected to the darker side of security, if you like. You know, their motivation to come via the supply system is fundamentally they would typically have weaker security. You know, if you're a big bank, if you're a big telco, if you're a pharmaceutical organization, or even if you've just taken security seriously in your organization and, you know, been proactive with it, you know, you've pretty much got your stuff in order. You've got your systems, your processes, you've got a good and capable security team. But you have lots of suppliers that don't, and they have a connection into your network, and that network connection is trusted. So why not use them to get to you? So it makes perfect and logical sense. So that's why there's such a focus on the supply chain going forward. And obviously today we're going to be looking at the non-IT areas and ensure, you know, my objective of today, if you like, is to make sure that they get equal weighting, you know, that we're not just focusing on cyber and information security, a strange thing to say for a security professional, but obviously I've seen in real life what can happen in terms of a business disruption that can happen from a non-IT risk. And I'll talk about some of them throughout the session. Okay, Scott, next slide. So what I advocate to all of the organizations I consult with is that we have a holistic and business aligned approach. So what do I mean about that? So your third-party risk management program has to be truly global. You know, there's no point having it if you focused on one country and you have another 62 countries out there where you haven't really done it properly. So we need to make sure that we've got that holistic coverage everywhere. And it needs to be business aligned. You know, we're doing this for a reason. Sadly, and I still do see, you know, organizations run a third-party risk management program because they've been told to do so, and they're ticking the box, right? So they use Microsoft Excel, they send out a questionnaire to their suppliers once a year. They might look at the response a little bit, but they certainly don't use that information to drive the business into some smart risk-based decisions. And you know, I'm a real big fan of this approach. You can't manage what you don't measure. So if you're not measuring it, you're not quantifying it, you're not assessing it, then you can't actively manage it. And we've already discussed about the focus that is coming from the regulators into the board and the executive team in your organization. So that focus and tension and the desire for information is going to start to trickle down into your functions and organizations, and you need to have a true, credible and capable answer. And I've worked with organizations that have been blindsided by issues in their supply chain. You know, they've gone out and they've done their questionnaires once a year, and they've got the information back, but it hasn't really truly informed them of the risk that a supplier was posing to them. Then something happens, and obviously the audit team and the regulators and the investigators come back to your process and say, well, did you assess this company? And you pull out the questionnaire, etc. And it's then when you realize that you're not really doing it properly. And you know, it can be complex, it can be challenging. I've done this several times, and obviously every time I've been a CISO, we've run this process in the organization. So I'm certainly not saying it's easy. But what you can do is obviously break it down into its component parts and just make sure that you're getting the right process in place within your organization. You can't really just capture it within the security team. It doesn't really add any value. It's how do you actually capture that information, add context from the security team, and then distill those messages into the business so that the business can react based on what you've done. And I'll help give that some context and information and color as we go through the rest of the presentation. Okay, Scott, next slide. So what, you know, one of the biggest challenges I see, and, you know, it's something worthy of discussion just to set the scene before we actually go into, you know, the non-IT risks, is we call it third-party risk management, but now we really have to go deeper. Many of the people that we would give a third-party relationship to will further onwardly contract that service. They might use offshore service providers, they might use their own captives that they have in other countries or in other locations. But we need to make sure, or they might subcontract it as well, which is, you know, the most typical aspect of it. And if we're only looking at the supplier that we give the contract to, and then they're subcontracting our data to other organizations, then we're not really following the full journey of the data. And equally so, we have to make sure that we start to do that now. And, you know, the more mature third-party risk management programs actually really follow that data, the end-to-end journey, and actually truly understand, at the negotiation and contract stages, who is going to be involved in liaising, manipulating, working with my data to make sure that you've actually got that covered off. And if you look at a lot of the compliance standards, which we definitely cover off later in the conversation, that is the requirement. You can outsource the responsibility for doing a task on your behalf and on your data sets, but you can't outsource your accountability. The accountability and the ownership of that data and that regulation sits firmly with you, and you have to make sure you've followed that throughout the supply chain. So don't just settle for third party. Ask the conversation, get the details of, who else is involved, fourth, fifth, sixth, nth. You've really got to go down into that level of detail. Okay, Scott, next slide. Right, so let's get into the meat of it. Hopefully we've set some of the context. And as always, this is just my opinion, and feel free to disagree in the chat or ask questions in the Q&A. But when I think of something that doesn't involve IT, and how can it really disrupt a business, even when they focused on this area, the top four that I kind of come out with are operational, compliance, corporate social responsibility, and financial. They have the ability to destabilize a supplier, and therefore that has a knock-on impact to you. So when we're talking operational, maybe they lose the ability to service your business and service the operation. What I'm thinking there is, the biggest problem, and yes, I'm going to use a security reason, but, what if they have a crypto malware outbreak? What if they have a, ability or inability to service you? What if there's an earthquake near their site, or there's a flood, or there's a strike, or there's political instability? There's 101 reasons, both IT and non-IT, that we can actually come up with. But, that has a major opportunity to disrupt your business. And then compliance, completely unbeknownst to you, they do something that actually puts your data and your compliance at risk. And we're going to get into each one of these as well, just to obviously get into the facts and some of the challenges and issues that may arise. And then if we look at corporate social responsibility, not everyone, obviously I'm sitting in the UK, the majority of you guys on the call are sitting in the US. Not everyone operates to our standards of ethics and what we would view as corporate social responsibility, but we have a requirement to make sure that they do. And then finance, obviously, big and small companies fail every day, and we talk a little bit about that later on in the presentation. So, these are my top four, and I see these happening day in, day out. And obviously, if you look at these and you think of these and you think, where is regulation going? Actually, it's kind of focused on these areas, right? So, and that's, pretty much around the globe. Okay, let me expand on why I think each one of these is kind of important and kind of critical. So some pictures, if we think about what can cause an organization operational risk challenges, well, first one has to be COVID, right? So no one saw it coming. Everyone went straight away pretty much to a work from home model. Policies and procedures within organizations were pretty much ripped up. So it caused a huge disruption. And some organizations, well, actually most organizations, especially those that have things like ISO 27001 compliance, would have had a pandemic flu policy. But honestly, how many people thought that it would have come into action? And how many people thought that it would actually introduce a complete new way of working with things like permanent flexible working, and offices shutting down, etc., and companies getting rid of real estate and allowing their employees to work from home? And if nothing else, that's drastically changed the data model. The data how it flows around the organization. People used to be sitting in the headquarters or a district office. They'd be on a corporate laptop, etc. Now that's changed. You've got bring your own device, people sitting at home, but they still need access to those customer data sets. So that introduces a different risk posture, and it could definitely cause disruption. And so obviously COVID has to be number one. And if we look at some of the political stability that we're seeing, so if we look at Russia, Ukraine, for example, again, it was coming, and then it was happening, then it wasn't happening, and then it did happen, right? And it's had a pretty much a major impact. But again, we may see that from a China-Taiwan situation as well. And I've got several organizations that I consult with actually modeling, what would happen if, like what's happened with Russia, sanctions are imposed and we can no longer actually do trade with China, we can no longer consume services or get products from China. And, that would have a pretty devastating impact. And then you have things that, things like the Suez Canal, a ship wasn't navigated properly by the captain or whoever was driving it at the time. And it actually hit the bank, spun around and was lodged in the Suez Canal. And then we had this huge backup of ships behind it that obviously were using that as the shortcut. So physical products and physical services weren't actually getting to their destination. And that was obviously causing huge challenges and, again, a huge operational risk. And then you have strange things like what's happening here in the UK, and I don't know whether you're all aware of this, but we had a huge problem in processed meat factories that we were buying in from Ireland and Italy and other countries as well, where, when we did DNA analysis on those meats and burgers, etc., and lasagnas and etc., there was horse meat contained in them, and this caused huge brand damage for supermarkets, etc. People, walked with their feet and said, obviously, we're not going to shop in your shop anymore. You've been feeding us horse meat. So things like this can have a huge impact as well. Okay, Scott, next slide. So I'm just going to expand on these a little bit, just to actually, these global events, they may be on distant shores, they may be far, far away from your organization, and you may think it won't have an impact, but it can, and it does. Things like cosmetics giant Revlon, in the US, they filed for bankruptcy recently. And, one of the main reasons that they filed for bankruptcy was supply chain issues. They couldn't get the raw materials to actually make their product. They couldn't service their customer base. Therefore, they couldn't actually create a product to sell. And obviously they went bankrupt. So this can actually have a huge impact. If you can't get hold of the raw materials that you need to make your product, then you've got a big issue. And that doesn't necessarily mean, an organization's got crypto malware. It might mean that your supply chain was from Russia or it was from China, and regulations come in and you haven't truly thought through, how do I put some geographic resilience into my supply chain in advance? So, we've got our supplies in fairly contentious countries, etc. So we need to build that resilience in. So if something should happen, then obviously we're not going to be, in significant problem. We can actually pull that supplies in from elsewhere. And I think very few organizations actually go really through that thought process and actually think these are a critical supplier to us, and actually they focus on that supplier, but they don't actually think about, well, what happens if they went away? What happens if we couldn't work with them? What happens if they went bankrupt? And actually have those backup relationships in place straight away. And I don't think many people, certainly here in Europe, it'd be interesting to hear what happened in the US, but many people didn't actually understand the true global impact of what was going to happen in Ukraine. I've put one example in there. They produce 54% of the world's semiconductor grade neon, and this has had a huge knock-on effect with companies like Intel, Nvidia, and others, because they need that to manufacture their chips. So, something happening far, far away from your parent organization can still have a pretty devastating impact on you. And it really is, the job of the security professionals, the procurement professionals, and working collaboratively with the business, not just to put these contracts in place for maximum cost reduction, maximum benefit, etc. It's really thinking things through and actually saying, well, what would happen if that we weren't able to transact with them? What's our backup plan? And, how easy is that backup plan able to bring into force? Great. Next slide, Scott. And then let's look at compliance risk. Compliance is only going to continue. I've been in security for, coming up for 30 years now. I know I don't look it, thank you. But, when I first started in security, yes, it was there, but now it's everywhere. And, it's rare to see a country that hasn't put some form of data legislation in to protect their citizens. And actually, there's over 60 around the globe. So if you're running a global multinational organization, yes, this becomes a little bit of a challenge because, even though there is a lot of overlap between them, each kind of has their own little nuance that makes it slightly different. And this is only one area of compliance around data. You can look at a million other areas of compliance. And again, each country kind of takes its own approach. And it's up for us to figure out, what are our requirements? What do we have to ask our suppliers to do? And ultimately, how can it trip us up, right? What are we looking for in terms of our key risk indicators to make sure that we don't fall foul of the regulators in our countries on how we handle data? And, you know, things like backups here can be a real challenge. You know, if you're pulling citizen data out to another country, etc., that can cause you issues and concerns. Okay, Scott, next slide, just where we kind of expand upon that. So, as I say, regulation has changed, you know, dramatically over recent times, and I've already mentioned today that, you know, you can't outsource your accountability, but you can outsource the responsibility. But it, you know, it has to be done correctly. You have to think, okay, they are our customer. We are accountable to them for effective security. You know, they're entrusting us with their data. You have an accountability to make sure that that trust isn't misplaced. And you need to make sure that you put in place the right processes. Then you as a business are making a decision that you're not going to do this service, whatever it is, in-house. It might be a call center, it might be managing a data center or a service that is customer facing, for example, but you're making a business decision to give that to someone else. Now that might be for improved, you know, customer service, it might be for a reduced cost, but that's a business decision that you are making. So then you have the accountability on behalf of your customer to make sure that that's going to happen in the right way. And that's really where, you know, you have to get into the contract. You have to actually understand exactly how is this service going to be built, who is going to be working on it, which countries are going to be, you know, contained in the full service wrapper. Are there any third, fourth, nth parties as part of this discussion? Because when you're talking about compliance, that's the length you have to go down to. You have to actually, you know, stipulate in the contract, this is the role that you're going to perform, and this is the role that I'm going to perform. And any nth party agreements that are in place obviously have to be fully documented as well. And if there's any change in that, then obviously that has to come back to the contract and be recoded in, because you need that chain of custody throughout that contractual relationship. So that, you know, if there are any issues, if there's someone in that supply chain that has a data breach that actually impacts your customer base, it's absolutely devastating. And obviously it's a real concern from an organization. But from a compliance perspective, you've done everything that you can. You've done things properly. And that's really where you need to focus on. And, you know, what I fully support, and certainly what I've done is really focus on what are those key controls that actually give you that day-to-day assurance. And again, I'm going to beat up Microsoft Excel here. So if anyone's using Excel on this call to manage, you know, their third-party risk management, then I really implore you to look at tools like Prevalent. Obviously, I don't work for Prevalent. I'm not a salesperson or anything like that, but I have used their tool in earnest to run supply chain security for me around the globe. And if you think about it, if you're using Excel, you send out, you know, a questionnaire, maybe normally once, maybe twice annually. That goes out to your customer base. They fill it in, they send it back to you. It lands on the table of analyst A, B, C, or D. They use their personal opinion and experience to understand what are the risks within this submission, and then they codify it into Excel. It doesn't introduce threat. It's far away from real time. So, you know, a once a year assessment, if you think about how quick and fast things change within your own organizations, that's exactly the same for the people that are supplying you services as well. New management come in, you know, cost pressures are introduced, new product lines, services, they spin up, you know, outsourced capabilities in different countries, which you might not want your data to flow to. So really having your finger on the pulse, you know, near real-time information is absolutely key. And I'd argue it's a core requirement for compliance, because, you know, most of the compliance around the world has a requirement that you disclose or that you know, share information with the regulator in a timely fashion. If you're on Excel, that's going to be a real problem for you to actually achieve. So again, another beat up for Microsoft Excel there. Okay, Scott, next one. So corporate social responsibility. So, you know, a big area, a very passionate area for me. And, you know, certainly when I've worked in the large multinational organizations, you know, a big focus. It's the right thing to do, and, you know, it has to be set and, you know, baked in, embedded within the culture of the organization. So what we're talking around here typically are things like child slavery, you know, backhanders or, you know, bribes, doing things ethically for the environment so that you're not polluting and, you know, poisoning rivers or putting, you know, really black smoke into the environment, etc. that you're not obviously focusing on modern slavery or anti-money laundering or money laundering and all of those aspects. So that's the areas that I think, can really impact an organization from a CSR perspective. Okay, Scott, next slide. So let's talk about this. And, it's a really interesting area. And, as I said, I've ran security for large multinational organizations. And to say that each country doesn't embrace CSR principles and ethics is putting it lightly. We have to accept that, things are done differently to how we would expect it to be done from a cultural norm. But we need to do global business. Our organization is going to start to operate in that way. So you have to think about how you set it up from the success on the outset. So again, when we're onboarding an organization, it's not just about looking at their security policies. It's not just about looking at their patching policies and all of the things that we're talking about today. You have to get under the hood of the company. Who owns it? Who are the key people? Who are the shareholders? Who can pull the strings behind the scenes on this organization? And equally, what's their way of working? And that's where you need the threat intelligence. Threat intelligence will give you all sorts of information about, how does this company operate? What are their ethical standards? Because, suppliers want to win business, and, lo and behold, they won't tell you the truth 100% of the time because they want to get this business and contract down from you. So the onus firmly lands on your shoulders to make sure that you've got, no CSR risks or no CSR responsibilities. If you're making clothing, for example, or if you're buying coffee or, any of those types of examples, you want to make sure it's fair trade. You certainly don't want to be selling a product in the US or the UK, for example, and then actually find out that it's being manufactured by child labor. But that could easily happen if we think about some of the examples that we've talked about. If you place a contract with an umbrella organization and you assess them from a risk perspective, but then they outsource it to some sweatshop in some, different geographic organization, and that's actually where your product is produced, unbeknownst to you. But you should have asked those questions. You should have got into those details. It's still your accountability and your responsibility to make sure that's covered off. And I think, there's a huge focus on this area, and rightly so. And the brand damage that can occur, we can all think about some of the headlines that have been in our different geographies that have, big companies, Nike, big supermarkets, for example, big coffee producers. They haven't followed their supply chain effectively through. Investigative journalists have, and they found out, that ethical standards that they claim to, abide by on their public facing statements don't hold water, and actually they have got child labor, or they have got forced labor actually producing their product. They're underpaying that labor, and the markup is extensive when it actually comes to sell their product. So be fair throughout your supply chain, and make sure obviously there's a good percentage of the profits are actually being used ethically to make sure your product isn't exploiting anyone. So I think that's a really important area for us all to focus on. Okay, Scott, next slide. So financial risk, and I think nothing helps bring this to life more than COVID. I don't think, certainly in the UK, I was doing some research. The more companies failed during COVID than any other time. And yes, they were smaller organizations that couldn't weather the storm, so to say, but actually it's a huge issue. Organizations, certainly the ones that I normally consult with, are actually twisting their way of working and actually wanting to work with smaller organizations. They want the ability to innovate. They want the opportunity that working with a smaller company might actually give them some, opportunity to diversify away from the competition in the market. And I think it's a real sad situation that so many smaller organizations actually closed within the COVID pandemic. But obviously there's other situations coming through as well. We've got monkeypox knocking on the door now. And, I think these waves of pandemics, I'm certainly not a virologist or anything like that, but if you look at this, they're often compared to, the malware world and the medical world, and new strains, variants, etc., pop up all of the time, either created by humans or, morphed from the animal kingdom to be able to affect us. So we have to get comfortable with this. So we need a model in place within your organizations to adequately assess financial risk. And, it's not typically the skill set of a security professional to be able to do that. So this is one of those areas where we have to recognize we have to work with the rest of the business. Every organization, with 10 plus employees will have someone that does finance on their behalf. And they've gone down an entire different skill set in terms of academic learning, capability and development, etc., to get to where they are. And as cyber professionals, we need to be able to tap into their knowledge and actually, say, this is the information that we're getting on this supplier. But again, Prevalent can help with that in terms of presenting information up to the security professionals if it's pretty obvious, that they're not in a good financial position and all of those aspects. So work collaboratively within your business, work collaboratively within your organizations. And I think, regulation is heavily focused on this area as well. Money laundering. I set up a service in Vodafone. It was in the African continent across most of the countries, and actually banking outside of South Africa isn't very prevalent. Excuse the pun. And actually, what we found is our mobile wallet, if you like, that we put on people's phones, became the main way that people bought and sold services. They had their salaries paid into it, so it essentially we replaced banks. What we discovered, obviously, is not everyone is ethically motivated, and huge attempts to launder money through those platforms, etc. So just because your product isn't intended to be used in that way, you have to really think through what are the unintended consequences of our products and services, and how can it be used and abused, because that can be changed and that can cause brand damage as well. And obviously, how much financial contingency do your suppliers have as well, and how much debt are they carrying? There was the global financial crisis. We all assumed that our banks were in a really healthy position, and then you had the subprime mortgage situation that started in the US and then spread across the world. And then all of a sudden we realized that our super stable banks aren't as financially stable as we thought they were, and all the governments had to step in and to bail them out. So don't just assume because it's a big brand and it's a household name that their financial stability is there, because things change overnight from a financial perspective, and we have to be able to monitor and look into that. Okay, Scott, next slide. So this is my last slide, because Scott's going to present, and then obviously we want 15 minutes to answer all of your questions. So what do we do? What to do differently? So I'm a big advocate for anyone that's listened to some of my other webinars that security shouldn't be a silo. We can't effectively just work within the security function. I used to walk into security teams, when I was joining as a CISO or working as a consultant, and they're all locked away behind speed gates or locked doors, etc. They're not embedded into the business. That way of working doesn't work anymore, so get out of the secure areas. You can secure the data, but you don't need to secure the area, as I always say. Embed the security team into the broader business and really tap into that non-IT expertise. We're talking about non-IT risks, so we need to get into those other areas of the business within the organization that can help us identify these issues. This isn't our typical skill set. So we need to work with, the HR team on people aspects. We need to work with the legal team on compliance aspects, and we need to work with the finance team on guess what, finance. They have that knowledge and experience that can really help us. And what I found really useful is actually sitting down with each of these areas and actually saying, how do we detect it? What are our KPIs and KRIs that we should be putting in place? What are the lead and lag indicators where we can start to see where something's gone wrong, or how do we detect when something's starting to go wrong? Putting those into your reporting platforms and being able to detect that early on is really important. And really ensure that you're working holistically across your supplier footprint. So what do I mean by that? So an example from my past is, again, if you're in a large multinational organization, you may have 3, 4, 5,000 suppliers. And, suppliers are different in each country. So a small supplier in one country might be a major supplier in another. And if you don't know about that can absolutely blindside you. So you need to know about your global business. And how do you do that? That's where procurement becomes your number one best friend. So you need to make sure that you're really tapped into that procurement process, and make sure that you've got your security controls embedded in that, so that no one can launch a new service on a credit card, no one can spin up a relationship with a supplier without it going through procurement and your sales, because that's your governance, that's your gate essentially. You can detect, you can make sure, you can get assessment. And one of the KPIs we talked about on the other webinar is that there should be no cash flowing to a supplier when they haven't gone through the due diligence process, because actually that can lead you open to compliance. You might be giving money to a sanctioned organization or a sanctioned individual. You might be actually partaking in money laundering. So you need to make sure that you're at the front end of the process and you've actually done that assessment and evaluation before any money starts to change hands. But then you can't be the bottleneck. That's where you need a tool like Prevalent to be able to rapidly get information on a supplier. Again, if you're looking at the Excel world, business starts a relationship with a new supplier. They approach the security team, you know absolutely nothing about them. You have to send them your questionnaire, then you have to wait for a response. In the Prevalent world, obviously you go onto the tool and the platform, and they've worked with hundreds of thousands of other customers who will likely have had a relationship with that supplier, and you get all of that information up front. So you're not starting from your blank Excel spreadsheet. You can start to build a picture really rapidly about what risk might this supplier potentially present to us, and actually really work through the scenarios. And it can be quite uncomfortable for a security team that's focused on cyber and information security, and actually sit them in a room and go, what would happen if the Suez Canal was blocked? What would happen if China invaded another country and we could no longer use them? What's the impact of the sanctions on Russia and any business that we had with them? Because they do have impacts. Ukraine still produced a massive amount of the world's wheat. So if you're in a food production business, that would have had impacts. We've seen what's happened to the global price of energy and all of these things. So each of these global situations that are happening in each of our newspapers and news programs around the world, if you really think it through, each of them will have some form of impact on your organization. So why not model that through in advance? Obviously, you're not going to be able to do everything. You haven't got a crystal ball, but really working with the business and actually saying, where are we going? What products and services do we have? What markets are we selling in? Where are we exposed to in terms of where we buy our services from or our products from, depending on what your businesses are? And how do you build resiliency into that? And resiliency is the key word. If something happens in one area, how can you be resilient against that? And that only works by actually being self-critical of yourself, by really analyzing all of that information and producing those playbooks so you've got that information at hand. And obviously just monitor and manage, those changes in global regulations. It's changing all the time. Every time I, look at what's going on from a regulatory perspective, what's going on in terms of how organizations work and working practices, the news is filled with political instability at the moment. And, this is only going to continue, and we have to get comfortable with that. We can't stop the world spinning, and we can't stop what's going on, or certainly most of us can't. So what we can do is manage our domain that we're accountable for more differently, and actually build that resilience in so we can minimize that business disruption. Okay, Scott, over to you, and then we'll get the questions at the end, yeah?
Sounds good, Brian. Everybody, I hope you really enjoyed Brian's part of the presentation here. Very comprehensive view of, all of those sneaky risks that can, creep up on you and might not be the ones we're looking at every day, because it's always the breaches and the cyber attacks and whatnot that kind of garner all the attention. But, as Brian kind of demonstrated and provides some examples of, illustrations of, is that, all these other types of risks can impact our organizations in ways that maybe we don't predict. And, if being a security professional myself, I'm not attuned to looking at the financials of a potential partner. I'm not attuned to looking at, executive turnover and eco violations and things like that to determine, whether or not there's going to be some disruption in the service that they provide. But it's essential that we do kind of enlarge our concentric circle of risk out from cyber and data protection and privacy and things to include some of these, hard to quantify type of risks to gain that holistic picture. It sounds like such a trite phrase to use, holistic picture, but cyber might be 60 to 70% of the risk surface you're facing with a third-party supplier vendor, but it's that other 35 to 40% that can sneak up on you and get you if you don't watch it too quickly. The issue from our perspective is that, a lot of companies try to do this, and then Bryan talked about the Excel example, try and address their problem of managing third-party risk using spreadsheets. And, we know the problems with it. We don't have to rehash that. One of the biggest outcomes of using a spreadsheet, for example, or backed by a SharePoint or Teams-based process, whatever, is that the data is outdated the minute you gather it, and lacking any sort of recency or real-time element, you're always dealing with old data. You don't have a good flow of information, coming into the enterprise to help you recalculate risk, risk exposure, likelihood, and impact of potential problems, whether that be, a blocked canal somewhere or, a huge data breach at a tier 1 supplier. Another thing complicating third-party risk management is that everybody's starting to get involved in it. You're probably feeling that pain, I bet. If you sit in a security organization, all of a sudden procurement folks might be knocking on the door going, hey, we'd like to learn a bit more about this, or who are these guys? And the more manual and the less real time the inputs are to the process, the greater frustration that's going to cascade throughout the enterprise if those teams aren't getting what they want from the assessment process. So you're spending tons of time, very manual, not really a whole lot to show for it. So that's kind of the landscape of the challenge in trying to do this the right way. We see third-party risk happening, not just looking at it from an IT versus non-IT perspective, but also looking at it at every stage of your relationship engagement with that third party. And every one of these steps has some unique risk elements to it. When you're sourcing and selecting a vendor, your procurement team is probably going to want to get a handle on their anti-bribery and corruption policies. They're going to want to know, are they financially resilient? Have they been breached in the past? Once you've made a decision on a vendor, you move to like the intake and onboarding side. Okay, great. What type of risks should we assess them for based on their interaction with our data, geographic, location, or regulatory influence, whatever. You score the inherent risk they bring to you, and that can be anything from how they touch and interact with your data, to the level of access into your IT systems, to whether or not they're a tier 1 supplier, if their widget is the key piece to your final product. Then we conduct more comprehensive assessments and remediation of findings on any number of regulations or frameworks to measure against for best practices. And then, as Bryan mentioned in the last point on his last slide, the monitoring and validation piece. Everything up to this point in the life cycle has been almost a point in time exercise. We take a look at somebody before we select them. We select them and we onboard. We do some inherent risk scoring to get a picture of what they look like. We develop our assessment strategy, and maybe we remediate some findings. Well, all those are kind of unique, kind of point in time activities. Well, monitoring by its very heart, by its very nature, is a continuous exercise. And that has to be performed on a regular basis to make sure that new risks are discovered in time, and that they can be addressed before they have some sort of downstream impact on your individual enterprise. But also, you also have to interpret risk as more than just whether or not they're introducing cyber or financial or whatever types of risks to the enterprise, but also how does their individual performance impact your service that you're providing your customers, right? So that's why it's important to measure SLAs and performance, again, moving toward that more continuous approach. And then finally, tons of risk is presented during the offboarding and termination phase. And we find that very few organizations have a disciplined and rigorous process, a checklist, if you will, to go through all the activities that have to be performed when you're offboarding a vendor, terminating a relationship, to make sure that your data is not continually exposed, it's been destroyed, final payments have been executed, contractual agreements have been addressed, and more. So again, IT versus non-IT risk, great way to look at it, but also IT and non-IT risk at every stage of that life cycle just further complicates matters as well. What I've done is I've kind of identified a couple of risk types that are addressed by the prevalent platform. And I'm not going to go through these in exhausting detail, but I do think this speaks directly to the point that Bryan addressed about there being security and non-security related risks. These different security domain areas are things that we track regularly, not just through the execution of third-party vendor and supplier assessments, but also through intelligence feeds that are continually being pumped into the platform to validate the assessment results, but also provide that real-time or continuous element or picture into updates on those vendors that can have some sort of material impact on you. So the standard security stuff that you can see in the blue block there, but business and operational risks. Does a merger and acquisition impact a supplier relationship? What's their credit rating, their payment history? Are they bankruptcy risk? Things like that. Speaking directly to the CSR risks that Bryan mentioned a minute ago, what are their ESG ratings? Are they listed on the US EPA's eco violations database? Do they have a modern slavery statement? Are they committed to diversity and hiring practices? These types of risks that are non-quantifiable, but at the same time, really talk about the kind of business you're doing business with. You're only as good as the people you do business with. You're only good as the people you hang out with, right? So you want to do business with good and ethical companies, and that sometimes doesn't come through in a cybersecurity assessment. Reputational risk speaks directly to that, and then finally compliance risk. So just a kind of a sample of some of the risk types that the Prevalent platform helps to address through assessment, continuous monitoring, kind of a one-to-one correlation with what Bryan talked about a minute ago. Again, my last slide, what I wanted to kind of communicate here was that, our approach to third-party risk management is, I think, comprehensive. It's very data-driven. The objective is to get you as much continuous, near real-time intelligence about your suppliers, whether that be from a cyber or a non-cyber perspective, to help you make good risk-based decisions, to unify it together in a single platform so that not just you, but also your procurement team, your risk management team, your security team, your legal team, internal auditors, and more can have the visibility they need to make good decisions at every stage of the life cycle, and do it in such a prescriptive way to where it takes the variability out of the process. It gives you the information at the step that you need it and the intelligence so that you can make good informed decisions, move on to the next phase, and ultimately reduce the risk across that life cycle with all the resources kind of behind you to help you do that. We've written a white paper that really encapsulates a lot of what Bryan talked about today, how to manage IT and non-IT third-party risks. You can see it at the link there, but we'll include it in the recording email that we send out to everybody either today or tomorrow, as Amanda said a little while ago. And it's a much, very detailed kind of prescriptive checklist-based approach that really reviews the domains of IT and non-IT risk, and then really explains some of the strategies to align teams in your enterprise based on the risk they're trying to manage at the stage in the life cycle trying to manage it. So, decent resource, something I encourage you to take a look at, but it's a good accompaniment to today's webinar. Anyway, all right, so that's what I wanted to share with you. That's kind of the Prevalent approach to how we manage both IT and non-IT third-party risk throughout the life cycle, and kind of what we can do to kind of transform what Bryan talked about into some sort of reality. So with that, Amanda, I'm going to pitch it back to you.
Thank you. Perfect. So I'm going to go ahead, and I have one more poll question for everybody. We're curious as to whether or not you're looking to augment or establish a third-party risk management program for the remainder of the year, or if you're prepping for 2023, we'd love to know about it. Please answer accordingly, because we will follow up if you are interested in chatting with us regarding that. So I'll leave that one up. I'm going to start from the top. So let's just remember the top is when you first started chatting, Bryan. So it'll be, it'll be your own quiz here of what you've already discussed. But the first question is, when you were mentioning CSR today, would you also group ESG in there as well, or does it depend on the country?
No, I mean, it completely depends on the country. They mean the same thing, right? And that's part of the challenge. So, In Europe, typically it's CSR, corporate social responsibility. In the US, it's environmental, social, and governance, etc. You know, one of the things I would really love to happen is regulators starting to talk. I put that map up, obviously showing, you know, the 60 plus different data regulations that are around the world. And it equally comes down to compliance and ethics, etc. There's so much overlap over these things, and the intent and the objective and the outcome is entirely the same. It would be amazing if we could just, as a globe, just align behind a standard and a compliance regime and all of those aspects. I think it would make our job entirely easier. So I think from a CSR and ESG thing, they're largely interchangeable. There may be a couple of nuanced aspects contained within them, but in terms of the principle of what we were talking around in the presentation, they're just different geographies and different reporting mechanisms, right? So.
Mm-hmm. That pretty much answered multiple questions, so I kind of went through. So the next one, I think we can focus on going back to ESG again. So this person, Indra Klein, I'm going to call people out that have names because pay attention, your question's being answered here. For orgs with a commitment to attaining and maintaining ESG goals and have third-party relationships in which there may be GBS entities in the supply chain, for example, India, Asia, Eastern Bloc countries, any thoughts on how orgs can better monitor practices that may impact ESG reporting? They're saying thinking in terms of cultural practices, nuances, employment practices, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to the culture of the organization and the controls. So obviously each organization has a headquarters, it has a CEO, it has a leadership team, and it has, you know, a cultural approach that it wants its organization to behave within. As I said, you know, if you're a global organization, and, you know, some countries were called out, many others exist, you know, where those practices aren't embraced, and, you know, even some countries exist where it's common for a bribe to be offered as part of the cultural norm, and then you're trying to operate a company in that country, and you don't want to behave in that way. So you obviously have to set, you know, this is how our company is going to operate. You have to make sure that you recruit, you have to, in the right way, you bring in people with the right belief system that actually aligns with your culture. You have to make sure that those people are onboarded effectively and have their training up front to say, it might be a cultural norm within your country, but this is the way we're going to operate. And then obviously the control environment comes in from an organizational perspective. And that's where, you know, third party is a key thing, obviously, to work with suppliers in that organization. You need the right financial and process controls in place to be able to get assurance over and above your employees to make sure that those processes are operating in line with your ethics. So yes, it does become more complex, but equally, we often focus on some of these problem areas and problem countries, but it doesn't mean to say it can't happen in other areas. You know, bribery has occurred in both of the jurisdictions on this call today, predominantly. So, you know, it can happen in our home organizations as well. So don't solely focus on an area you think it may occur. You have to focus everywhere, because, you know, I've had situations in my career where employees, for example, have set up their own organization to sell into their parent company, etc. They've got the buying decision. They obviously buy from their own company, etc., at an inflated price, and obviously they reap the rewards. So that isn't a cultural way we want to work. So you have to think, you know, people may want to do that, people have done that, and people will do that in the future. So what controls can you put in place to detect that that doesn't happen, right? So that's it's basically, again, thinking it through in advance, thinking, you know, that if this happens, how would we detect it? And then obviously setting that behavior into your culture of your organization.
Well, if that ain't an answer, I don't know what is. I have two from Jorge Barroso. So Jorge, here we go. What is the best way to assure operational risk by developing risk operational scenarios that involve technologies?
Yeah, well, I think it's, you know, it's really producing the play, what I call the playbook, what some companies will call the green book. You know, it's the role play of, you know, what if, and, you know, what if something happens, how will we behave, who will be involved? And obviously bring technology into the mix. You know, I don't know, salesforce.com or something like that. You're heavily reliant on that for business process. Obviously, Salesforce doesn't just run your CRM or your sales channels. Equally, they can run a banking portal now and lots of other services. So if you're heavily reliant on Salesforce from an operational perspective, then obviously you have to make sure, you know, what would happen if they were to go away. And I'm certainly not saying that you would, you know, spin up a replica service and pay for that in advance. You'd make sure that Salesforce have the right resiliency baked into their product and service. You'd want to understand their business continuity, their disaster recovery capabilities, and I'm sure they'll sell you more services to make sure that that's, you know, 100% nailed down from your perspective. But again, it comes down to the criticality of the technology, you know, the level of resilience that you would build into that service. But, you know, if it's core to your platform, it can't go away. You need that 99.999 recurring percent availability. Then you have to bake that into the solution design, right?
I have a bit more of a complex question here that I wanted to get through before we run out of time. But Rob Brickman mentioned your discussion of operational risk is largely from an outside-in perspective, external threats to business continuity, etc. After 20 plus years in third-party risk management, the single greatest operational risk I deal with is more internal contract. Oh, wait. This is really just him talking. I'm sorry, Rob. You threw me off here. I thought this was a question, but he was just chatting. Okay.
I think
We're gonna move.
he is right though, Amanda. And
Yeah.
I will take
You
that
finished.
feedback.
Okay. Go ahead.
He is absolutely right. You know, my examples were all about, you know, what can happen outside the organization, but you know, there is that threat from inside and just not doing things correctly. I mean, what he's talking around there is, you know, when the contractual relationship's put in place, that it's not truly thought through. You know, we're setting unclear expectations on suppliers that they can never deliver upon, and the relationship turns toxic. So we do have that, you know, we have to look inside our organization as well to make sure not just that process is followed that Rob's talking around, to make sure that the contract's set up for success, but equally around that insider threat. You know, you can have operational challenges that come from inside your organization that might not be non-IT as well, right? So yeah, I'll take that feedback, Rob. Yeah.
Let's look at the second question from Jorge. He says, how can you summarize the compliance risk for third-party risk management to avoid complexity?
Yeah, well, I think that's a challenge. You know, by its very nature, compliance is complex. As I said, you know, it'd be great if the regulators work together. The way I've done it in a large global organization before is you can't operate your global business to 60 odd different data standards. So you have to pool the requirements of those standards and operate your business to the highest level of requirement of each. So it doesn't matter where you're operating, you're exceeding those requirements. So for example, if you're a financial services organization, the MAS in Singapore, the financial regulator, will require that you disclose to them a security incident within 1 hour. In others, you might have 24-hour time, etc. So run your global business to 1 hour. There's no point trying to fragment it and understand all the complexities of the different, you know, requirement legislation. Find the most stringent and run your business to that requirement. That's the only way you can run a global process, right?
And I'm going to do one last question since we're at 60 seconds before the end here. This is Donna Estwick. She says, what is the recommended best approach to supplier segmentation?
So there's two things that you might have been referring to. So supplier segmentation in terms of third-party risk management is typically to put them into 3 distinct tiers, you know, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And that dictates the amount of time that you focus with it on each supplier. You know, if they're a tier 1 supplier, they get more attention and focus, physical audits and all such like. You may have been, you know, talking around how I segment the actual, you know, risk perspective in those aspects. And, you know, that's a completely different conversation and a completely different webinar. So I'm hoping you're talking around how we tier them. So it's typically, you know, 3 tiers, and that dictates how much time you spend with them, right? So
perfect. Well, thank you so much, Bryan. That's all really what we have time for today. If we didn't answer your question, always feel free to just email us at info@prevalent.net. I just put in the oh, is it just I need to do it to everyone. I'm putting into the chat a link about the Verizon data breach that Bryan had mentioned. So in case you guys were interested in looking at that a little bit deeper, and I just want to reiterate one more time that we will send the recording, we will send the slides, and we will send the white paper that Scott just also recommended as well within the communications email. So if anyone that ever registered for this, maybe you're not even here right now, you will be receiving this as early as tomorrow, if not sooner. So please stay tuned for that. Check your spam if you don't see anything. And that is all from us. We hope to see you next time, and have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thanks so much, Bryan and Scott.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you, everyone.
Bye.